Today is Friday, June 11th, and I'd like to talk a little bit about the subject of classical reasoning and answer the question, how to learn, or how can we learn the art of reasoning? How can we learn the art of reasoning? First of all, before we get into the actual process or method of learning the art of reasoning, we should take a few minutes to talk about what reasoning actually is and separate it from some modern mistakes that are made in modern schools, and especially the fake classical schools that I talked about in talks yesterday. Because we have to get the actual art right and understand what we're doing before we can talk about how we should master it and enjoy the use of it. The good news is that the art is already written out for us and explained, and we simply have to study the books, as it were. The problem is that it's surrounded with confusion, and that often leads us into trouble. So, what is the art of reasoning? It's important, first of all, to acknowledge that it's an art. It's not a spiritual gift. It's not something we're born with. It's not something that people gain by some kind of grace. Of course, it could be. God can do anything, but this idea that God gives gifts to people and just loves to pour out miraculous powers is popular because it supports a lazy life and gives people excuses. Anytime someone doesn't want to do something, they can simply say they don't have that gift. And so the real motivation for talking about gifts all the time and graces all the time is that it actually provides lazy people with excuses for not doing things that are within human power and that require work and sacrifice. So reasoning is an art. That means that it can be gained through learning and practice, through study and practice. Once we understand that it's an art, we then have to ask, how can we obtain mastery of this art? Now, if we go back into ancient history, what we'll learn is, for most of ancient history, the art of reasoning was not known. Men were stronger or weaker in the actual work of reasoning, and it was considered to be a gift, or just sort of a skill that was gained by experience. Maybe somebody had a certain disposition that made them more effective in reasoning, but the art of reasoning was not known. What started to happen, especially in Greek culture, because there was an interest in local democracy in Greek history, what happened was democracy introduced some good things, but also lots of bad things. And the wise men picked up on this, because there were men called sophists who would take advantage of democratic procedures and use those opportunities to mislead people with clever fallacies, clever speeches that the common people couldn't resist. They couldn't understand what was wrong because they were deceptive and misleading, and no one could put their finger on what was wrong. And it was very difficult for a common person to find the error in what was being done, and the sophists did this intentionally. They had basically learned some of the principles of the art of reasoning, but they used them to deceive. And so good and honest, wise men, seeing this happen, began to realize that they needed to study the works of the sophists so that they could figure out what exactly the sophists were doing, and they could explain it to the common people. And this is where the art of rhetoric rose up. The problem with the art of rhetoric, as Aristotle explains in his Rhetoric, is that most people, just like today, are only interested in, or were only interested in rhetoric for the sake of making speeches. They weren't interested in the complete art of rhetoric. They were only interested in figuring out how to make a good speech. Very superficial, shallow interest in the subject, just like we see in modern schools where they don't teach the art of reasoning, they just teach the art of public speaking. The art of public speaking, that's what men were originally interested in the ancient world. They just wanted to be persuasive orators. They wanted to win votes. They wanted to win cases in court because they could win money and influence by a good speech. But they weren't really interested in the art of rhetoric, and that's why Aristotle's Rhetoric, which he wrote, was the breakthrough where the real art of reasoning, or art of rhetoric, was established. And Aristotle explains this in the opening chapters of his Rhetoric. He explains what's wrong with other rhetoric instruction, is that it doesn't get to the real issues. It doesn't get to the real issues, and the real issues are how something can be proven. That's the real issue, is proof. And so Aristotle goes through and explains the art of rhetoric with the right focus. What Aristotle also clarifies in his work on rhetoric is that it's not the orator's job to persuade his audience, to win the audience. That's not the orator's job. That's not the lawyer's job. Because it's impossible. Because man has free will. And when man has freedom, as in a democracy, he's free to choose badly. He's free to know that something is good and choose what's bad because he's morally bad. And the rhetorician shouldn't be judged based on whether or not he actually causes someone to choose the good, because that's not in his power. But he should be judged based on whether or not he employs every argument and every tool that is in his power to do so, even if the end result is that he doesn't gain the desired effect. And so Aristotle defines rhetoric as the art of discerning all of the available means of persuasion in any given case. And so it's important to understand that one of the things that Aristotle worked to explain and solve was the problem that we tend to not seek these studies for the right reasons, and that leads us to pursue them in the wrong ways. So Aristotle and other wise men were concerned about the sophists and their effect in democratic society. They were concerned about the vulnerability of the common people to clever men who, once they started to learn some of the principles of reasoning, could use them to actually strategically deceive people. And they had to work to establish the art of rhetoric and the art of reasoning so that the people could study, at least some of the people could study, but that it could be explained clearly to people what was going on and what was wrong about arguments, false arguments that were used to deceive them. It's helpful for us to think of what St. Ignatius of Loyola said about the devil. He said, the devil is a sophist. The devil is clever and cunning and will use the knowledge of human reasoning and human senses and human thinking to actually deceive people. That's what sophists are. And the world is full of sophists. Now, as I said, Aristotle produced a work on the art of rhetoric, which we study in classical rhetoric. But the work of the art of reasoning was much more difficult, much more complicated. In Socrates, we have the beginning of the discovery of the art of reasoning. We have what's called the Socratic method. And Socrates, what he contributed to the history and development of true philosophy, what he contributed was a method. And I stress the word a method, a method. The Socratic method is a method. It deals with one certain kind of discussion that has one certain kind of result. What Socrates contributed was called the Socratic method, but we can understand it more clearly if we explain it as dialectical reasoning. Dialectical reasoning. It's a certain kind of reasoning. In the Socratic method, Socrates seeks not to establish or prove the truth of things. This is what's important to understand. Socrates doesn't seek, or rarely seeks, positive, demonstrative proof of things. That's not what Socrates does. What Socrates does is he shows us that an opinion that's held by a person is impossible. That's what the Socratic method does. The Socratic method is a method by which we show that a certain opinion can't be true. It's a negative method. It shows what can't be true or is not likely true. What the Socratic method does is ask a question which offers only two possible answers, a yes or a no. Or, it doesn't have to necessarily be yes or no, but it's a question which admits only one of two possible answers. And we have to be careful here because one of the fallacies that we'll learn about is called a false dilemma. And a false dilemma is a question where we're told or we're made to think that there are only two possible choices, but there are in fact many more, or at least one more. That's called a false dilemma. The questions asked by Socrates are not false dilemmas. They're actually true dialectical questions. And a dialectical question, as I said, is a question that's controversial, that's debatable, it's not obvious, and that admits only two possible answers, which are contraries. They're contraries to each other. And so Socrates will ask a question like this. And then what he'll do is he'll use the respondent's answer to lead to another question, and lead to another question, and lead to another question. And if the respondent's answer to the question is false, what will happen in time, as that answer is assumed to be true, is that it will lead to some difficulty. It will lead to some obvious error. And once that point is reached where those in the discussion see that following the respondent's answers has led to a crisis, where there's an obvious error, the discussion can be traced backwards, and we can find at which question we left the truth. And we know that that question, the answer that was given to that question, must be false. And the contrary must be true. Or may be true. And this is the Socratic method. It's a method of investigation that's primarily concerned with proving that existing answers to questions are false. And what's important about the Socratic method is that its usefulness is limited to showing what's false. What the Socratic method doesn't do is establish philosophical science or absolutely certain knowledge, systematic and certain knowledge. The Socratic method can't do that. And that's one of the faults of Platonism, is that Platonism was more of a negative philosophy than a positive philosophy. And that's why Plato's philosophy is presented as it is in the form of Socratic dialogues. Whereas Aristotle's doctrine is presented in treatises that state the scientific knowledge. So let's ask, well, what's the difference with Aristotle? How does Aristotle do that? And this goes back to Aristotle discovering and perfecting the art of reasoning. The Socratic method of dialectical reasoning is useful in getting the discussion started, in getting an investigation started, because usually our minds and our communities are filled with all kinds of false ideas based on appearances, based on false assumptions, and so on. And when people think that they're right about issues, it's hard to teach them positively. And what we need to do first is we need to create in them a sense of doubt or uncertainty. We need to make them realize that what they think is true might not be true. And so the first challenge is to reason with people in a certain way so that we can lead them to question whether or not what they think is true is in fact true, to lead them to this point of doubting, self-doubting. And hopefully we can actually prove to them that their opinions and views are actually false and or impossible, which would be the goal. That it's the goal of a Socratic discussion, is to lead someone to see that their opinion is impossible. That's the goal. Not always possible to do that, but that's the goal. To lead them by their own answers into an impossibility, which reveals that the answers that they've given can't be true. So that's the first step, to shatter confidence that someone has in their opinions, and to make them willing to listen and learn an alternative, and then put that alternative to the same kind of investigation and examination as we did their original opinion, and show that it's superior. Now, in order to pursue a more positive philosophy, and by positive I mean rather than just saying what's not true, we actually go ahead and say what is true. That's always a very different level in anything. For example, doctors can tell you, don't eat this, don't eat this, don't eat this, don't do this, don't do this. And that's helpful to a degree. But if the doctor can't go ahead to the next step and say, what you should do is this, and give you a positive plan that when followed produces positive results, well, the negative counsel is only so helpful. We need positive counsel as well. The same is true, and this is why I object to people who spend all their time criticizing the church and criticizing society and criticizing schools. You know, that doesn't make you a smart person or a wise man, because you can find fault with things. Unless you're ready to propose the positive solution, your criticism is just idle gossip. Most people already know the things you're complaining about. And there's nobody on earth who imagines that the Catholic Church is practically perfect. And so sitting around whining all the time about the church and the clergy and how this is not perfect, you know, who are you even talking to? Who disagrees? That's just useless. Same thing with education, same thing with modern society. Like, you're criticizing something that everyone already knows is flawed. You're just wasting time. If you're not going to provide a positive alternative that's actually practicable and realistic, you're just whining and gossiping. So after Socrates basically made everyone angry by proving that everything that they thought and taught was false, philosophy was challenged with the need to go to the next step and create positive philosophy. And this wasn't possible with the Socratic method. And so another method had to be developed. And this method was developed by Aristotle. We could call it the Aristotelian method. We could also call it the demonstrative method. The demonstrative method. So the Socratic method is a dialectical method. The Aristotelian method is the demonstrative method. They're both necessary. Now, what's unique about the method of Socrates is that we don't have to assume anything to be true other than what the speaker or the respondent admits to be true. We take the respondent's answers as true, and we reason from them, even though the respondent's answers could be false. We admit them as true for the sake of this dialectical investigation or examination. But, as I said, we can't establish any truth positively in that way. And so a different method is needed. And the first thing that needs to change is that the starting points need to be different. We can't take someone else's responses as our starting points. We need to start with something that's absolutely true, and then reason from that to conclusions that are also absolutely true. And that's how science, in the classical sense, is developed. So, wise men had to work to begin determining what the sources were of absolutely certain starting points for philosophical investigations. And they could start with things like axioms. We see this in Euclid's geometry. They could start with things like axioms, statements that are self-evident and known to be true to everyone, like a part is less than a whole. That's an axiom. No one can dispute it. It's true. So we have to find absolutely certain starting points to reason from. Not only that, we had to learn and understand how reasoning actually works. What is the actual mechanism of reasoning? That was as yet unknown, even though in the time of Socrates, it was beginning to be understood how reasoning actually worked. But Aristotle was the one who made it clear in his work on reasoning. Now, as for this work of reasoning, it's called the Organon in Greek. It consists of 6 books. I always get the number of books in the Organon confused with the number of our sacred scripture courses. But the books of the Organon are the Categories by Aristotle. The second book is On Interpretation. The third book is called the Prior Analytics. The fourth book is the Posterior Analytics. The fifth book is the Topics. And the sixth book is called Sophistical Refutations. These 6 books taken together are Aristotle's work on the art of reasoning. It's called the Organon because in Greek that word means the method or the instrument, the tool, as it were. So when you see the Socratic method, it's a method. And when Aristotle presents his Organon as this work composed of 6 books, he pushes this forward onto the table and says, here is my method. Okay, so the Socratic method can't be equated with quote-unquote classical logic or classical reasoning. There's more to reasoning than the Socratic method. The Socratic method is actually a part of Aristotle's complete art of reasoning. And as I just listed those 6 books that make up the Organon, the 5th book, the Topics, is actually where Aristotle teaches the art of dialectical reasoning, or the Socratic method. That's in book 5, the Topics of the Organon. But before that, there are 4 other books that come first in Aristotle's system. The first book is the Categories. And the reason why the Categories comes first is because Aristotle realized that one of the chief sources of deception for the sophists, the sophists, was the clever use or misuse of words. So they play word games or semantics in their deceptions. And Aristotle was able to discover what they're doing, how they do what they do, and he was able to explain it and teach it so that we could be on guard for it. He talks about how words are used in 3 different ways. He talks about homonymous use of words, synonymous use of words, and paronymous use of words, and explains that in reasoning, we need to make sure that anytime we use a word in 2 different places, it's used in the same sense in both places. That's what it means to use words synonymously. Don't get it confused with modern school talk about synonyms. That's something different. But anyway, we learn about the use of words, the right use of words in the categories. And we learn about the categories themselves, the 10 different classes of predicables. I'm not going to get into all of that in this talk, but that's what's studied in the categories. Then in the book on interpretation, Aristotle explains the principles of sentences, and that there are different kinds of sentences, and not all of them are appropriate in logical discussions or investigations. He explains that there's only one kind of sentence that's appropriate in reasoning, and that's called enunciation or declarative speech. If we study classical languages, it's helpful because we see that there's different forms, different moods, and those different moods represent these different kinds of sentences. Therefore, only sentences in the indicative mood are appropriate in any logical argument. In the next two books, Prior and Posterior Analytics, Aristotle teaches and explains the mechanism of reasoning, how reasoning actually works in our minds. He explains how arguments are formed so that we can evaluate arguments and see whether they're valid or not valid, whether the reasoning actually follows. The true argument is called a syllogism. A syllogism is a pair of statements. A pair of statements which, when read or thought about by the process of reasoning, lead us to a necessary third statement. That's how reasoning works. Our minds, because we are gifted by birth with the faculty of reasoning, if we're presented with two indicative statements, our minds will discern a relationship between those sentences that leads to a necessary third statement. And that's the process of reasoning. Now, that process can be true or that process can be false. The process itself can be false. So you can look at a statement and evaluate a statement and declare whether it's true or false. But you can also look at an argument, the two statements and the conclusion drawn from them, and judge whether that conclusion is necessary and whether that syllogism is valid. And so we have a number of different things to test in reasoning, and Aristotle explains all of that in the two books on the analytics, and that's called demonstrative reasoning. In the fifth book, he deals with the topics and teaches the art of dialectical reasoning, or the Socratic method. And then lastly, in the final book, the Sophistical Refutations, he introduces us to the most common fallacies or tricks used by sophists, and he explains what's wrong with them, so we can understand how they're deceiving us, and then we can be aware and be able to discern when those fallacies are being used, and we can escape from them without getting trapped. And again, that's why it's helpful to remember that St. Ignatius of Loyola taught that the devil is a sophist. The art of reasoning is actually necessary in our salvation because it allows us to resist temptations. It allows us, even in our own thoughts, the thoughts that we have are sophistical fallacies. And if we are trained in the art of reasoning, we can refute our own thoughts, the temptations of our own minds, the temptations within ourselves, and of course, temptations that come from outside sources. So this is the art of reasoning, the Organon of Aristotle. Now we have to study this formally. We have to study these 6 books. We have to start with the categories and work our way through the entire Organon, because we have to know the whole art. What we'll find in most schools is that they just want to play around with parts of the art of reasoning to be able to offer a course that they can call logic, or sell some workbook. We see people will write books, for example, about fallacies, and everyone will learn these names of different fallacies, and then they'll walk around and imagine that they're fallacy detectives. That's actually the name of one of these books, The Fallacy Detective. And people who've never studied the art of reasoning and really have no idea what they're talking about will imagine that they're now able to spot fallacies, and anytime you talk, they'll try to accuse you of committing some fallacy and throw some name at you, red herring, or that's a hasty generalization, or some name of some fallacy that they've learned, without even knowing what the actual definition and real nature of that fallacy is, and that half the time they're accusing people of using fallacies, the conditions of those fallacies aren't even met. For example, you could point out someone's personal problems in a legitimate way, in a debate. For example, I'll give you an example from Scripture. St. John, in his first epistle, says that there are false teachers who say that they love God, or say that they know God. But we can prove that they don't know God because they don't love the Christian brethren. And so St. John would say, look at how you relate to the Christian brethren. You hate your brother. That's proof that you don't know God. Now, these arrogant, modern, fake logic students would accuse St. John of a personal attack, or an ad hominem argument, because he appealed to their personal behavior. And they would accuse him of a fallacy when that's not what the ad hominem or ad hominem fallacy even is. And I get this all the time, because I'll point out things in people's personal lives that proves that their opinions and things like that are either contradictory or hypocritical or not sincere. And they'll always try to play this game like, oh, that's an ad hominem attack. Oh, that's a hasty generalization. Just because something is a generalization doesn't mean it's a hasty generalization. Doesn't mean it's a false generalization. If I say all men are mortal, are you going to accuse me of making a generalization as if that's false? The only way a generalization is false is if you can provide a proof that it is in fact false. But instead of doing that, instead of actually refuting the argument, they'll just throw this label at you as if that's the end of the discussion. And that's just fake. It's just fake reasoning. And that's what modern schools tend to do. They tend to give these poor kids an oversimplified, shallow introduction to the art of reasoning. And then what makes it worse is they tell the kids that they have actually studied the art of reasoning. You know, the teacher calls the class classical logic and gives some 14-year-old kid an A, and that kid walks away with this idea that he got an A in classical logic when he's never even studied the art of reasoning. And that's what's especially dangerous about the fake classical schools, is they actually give the kids a sense that they've learned something and know something that they haven't, in fact, learned. It's like telling a man that his fighting skills are great just to make him happy, and that gives him confidence, and then he rushes into a fight and gets his face broken because he was told that he was a great fighter when in fact he wasn't a great fighter. And that's the kind of thing we see Christians doing in modern society. We see kids rushing into issues. We see people talking about controversial subjects and topics, imagining that they're bringing the reasoning to the discussion because somewhere someone told them that they're good logic students or that they've studied logic. And they make a mess and embarrass themselves. A great example of this, that's, if I say this is going to get everybody upset, but it's the truth. A great example of this is the pro-life movement. The pro-life movement is a colossal example of the danger of thinking that you are more clever than you actually are. The Christians, all the pro-life Christians, got themselves into this fight against abortion, and what they actually did by not knowing what they were doing was they allowed the pro-abortion people to define their position as the pro-choice position. And the pro-life side, being so overconfident in their cleverness, called themselves the pro-life movement. And most of the pro-life movement took up an all or nothing position on abortion and called for the universal criminalization of abortion, thinking it's so clever. They're such clever, politicians and social activists. And they allowed the pro-abortion people to take a moderate position and define their position as not the pro-abortion side, but the pro-choice side. And so now, anyone who's not willing to embrace the universal position of the pro-life movement will vote pro-choice. For example, if a person thinks that abortion should be allowed if a woman is raped, but abortion shouldn't be just accessed at will, but they do believe that there are certain situations where abortion might be allowed without criminal penalties. Which side will they vote for? Will they vote for the pro-life side that wants to universally criminalize abortion? Well, they can't, because there are these situations where they think maybe it wouldn't be right to criminalize that choice. It wouldn't be right to punish that woman. So they vote pro-choice. Whereas that's not the pro-abortion position. The pro-abortion just wants free access to abortion on demand. But because the pro-abortion people cunningly took the pro-choice position, they receive all of the votes of anyone not willing to go all in on universal criminalization. And the pro-life, pro-choice, abortion controversy was lost by that error, by the pro-life movement. And I hate to say it, but it's never going to be fixed. It's lost forever. Unless somehow the pro-life movement could get these two sides to redefine themselves so that their position isn't extreme. But anyway, that's an example of the danger of what happens when people who think that they know something they don't enter into controversial issues, and even though they represent the truth, they lose the argument. And I personally don't think that Roe versus Wade will ever be overturned, because I think that the pro-life movement lost it once and for all when they allowed the sides to be defined as they are. It's starting to rain here, just a shower, so I'm going to stand under a tree for a bit. Again, that was just an example of how an unjustified confidence in one's reasoning ability gets them into a controversy that they end up losing, even though their position is the truth. And that's common in modern schools today. So, how can we learn the art of reasoning? The answer is very simple. Study Aristotle's Organon. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, we make this very easy because we have the whole Organon on the website available for study. We start with the categories and work our way straight through 6 books to the sophistical refutations. It's a very difficult study, but not impossible. It requires time and effort, and it's a study that's worth the time and effort. There's one addition we make to the study in the Academy, and that's there's a book that we add at the beginning. It's a book written by the philosopher named Porphyry. He wrote a book titled The Introduction, and in that book he introduces some key ideas that are necessary for us to rightly understand Aristotle's categories, and it's used as an introduction to the Organon. So our Classical Reasoning 1 course starts with Porphyry's introduction, and then we move to categories and on interpretation in Classical Reasoning 1. In Classical Reasoning 2, we study the prior analytics. In Classical Reasoning 3, we study the posterior analytics. In Classical Reasoning 4, we study the topics. And then in Classical Reasoning 5, we study the sophistical refutations. And if you're interested in learning the art of reasoning, that's how you study it. The biggest criticism, the greatest criticism that I'll offer for modern schools, and when I say modern schools, I include in this modern Catholic schools, modern classical Christian schools, because if you look at the curriculum, you'll just find that the most important study in the entire curriculum, especially in a K-12 or in a preparatory education, the most important study that there is the Organon, because it is the method or the instrument that's necessary for the pursuit of wisdom through philosophical investigation. The fact that schools aren't built around the art of reasoning is what's wrong with modern schools. The fact that any school that calls itself classical isn't dominated by focus on the art of reasoning is all the proof that you need to see that it's not a true classical Catholic school. And as I said, if you were going to ask me what should you focus on in studies to become wise, my answer would be become a master of Aristotle's Organon. That's what you should master if you want to be a wise man. Aristotle's Organon. Now, once we learn the Organon, which by the way is called rational philosophy, we can go on to study Aristotle's philosophical works. For example, moral philosophy, natural philosophy. And the reason why we can study them is because once we've learned the instrument, once we've learned the method, in these other philosophical sciences, we simply see Aristotle applying that method to those investigations. And we see that method leading Aristotle beyond the philosophy of Plato, and we see him discovering and proving a number of errors in Plato's philosophy, and that leads to the establishment of the true Aristotelian philosophy. And before the Protestant Reformation, before the Enlightenment, and not the Enlightenment, the Renaissance and the Reformation, all through European history it was understood that Catholicism and Aristotelian philosophy were two sides of the same coin. And that's why the Protestants didn't just reject Catholicism, they also rejected Aristotelianism. And that's why on the one side of the coin, just as with Catholicism and Aristotelianism, on the other side, you've got another coin, and that coin is Protestantism and modern, what's called inductive philosophy, or the scientific method. That's the rejection of Catholicism and Aristotle. And that's what is really behind Protestantism in modern society. And I talk about that in other talks, so I'm not going to get into that now. So that's how to learn the art of reasoning. If you'd like to study it in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, you're welcome to do so. This year, I'm going to be hosting live online classes if you'd like to participate in those classes. The actual course materials are available online and you can access them for free. If you'd like to study them with graded assignments and live support and things like that, then you can enroll in the courses. But that's how you do it. It's not a mystery. It's a very difficult study, but you have to consider the value of the mastery of the art of reasoning, and then realize that it's worth, you should expect it to be costly, and you should be willing, if you're sincerely interested in it, you should be willing to invest time and effort to get it. I hope that's helpful. That's how to study and learn the art of reasoning. God bless.